Introduction to the concept of poverty of spirit. The phrase, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," comes from the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew 5:3, one of the central teachings of Jesus. This statement invites us to rethink what it means to be blessed and what it means to have a poor spirit. At first glance, it may seem counterintuitive. How could being poor, especially in spirit, be a blessing? Isn't wealth and abundance generally seen as signs of success and favor in society? But as Jesus often did, he turns our understanding of worldly values upside down to reveal deeper spiritual truths. That Jesus' teaching on poverty of spirit is not about literal poverty or lacking material goods. Instead, it refers to an inner attitude of humility, recognizing our spiritual need and dependence on God. To be poor in spirit means to acknowledge that we are spiritually bankrupt without God's grace, to admit that we cannot rely solely on ourselves to find true fulfillment and purpose. It is an invitation to let go of pride, self-reliance, and arrogance, and to adopt a posture of openness, humility, and receptivity to God's presence in our lives, in contrast to the material poverty that many experience, where one's lack of resources can lead to physical suffering. Poverty of spirit refers to the humility of the heart. It is a spiritual state of recognizing one's limitations and embracing God as the ultimate source of life and strength. This kind of poverty does not denote weakness, but rather it represents strength through humility and surrender to God. It is a paradox. By acknowledging our weakness, we find true strength in God's power. Jesus, through his life and teachings, modeled this poverty of spirit. He did not come to this world in wealth, power, or glory. Instead, he chose a humble life and even declared that he came to serve, not to be served. Mark 10:45. He was dependent on his Father, and this dependence made him a perfect example of spiritual poverty. His life teaches us that greatness in the kingdom of heaven comes not from earthly achievements, but from recognizing and embracing our need for God. In our modern world, many are focused on material success, status, and accumulation of wealth. However, the true blessing comes not from acquiring possessions, but from cultivating a heart that is poor in spirit. This does not mean that one must live without material possessions, but rather that material wealth should not become the foundation of one's identity. A person who is poor in spirit sees possessions and achievements as temporary and holds them loosely, understanding that they are not the source of true fulfillment, that real-life examples of people who live humbly and respect simplicity can be seen in many corners of society. There are individuals who may not have great wealth or status, but are rich in kindness, generosity, and compassion. These are the individuals who serve others without seeking recognition or reward. They embody a spirit of humility and openness to others, and through their actions, they reflect the values of the kingdom of heaven. Whether it's a volunteer who gives their time to serve the homeless, or a person who chooses to live simply so that they can give to others, these people demonstrate the beauty of a spirit that is poor, humble, and completely open to God's love. Jesus' statement, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," is a radical teaching that invites each of us to reorient our lives away from the pursuit of personal gain and towards a life of humility, dependence on God, and service to others. It challenges us to ask, what is the source of our identity? Is it in the things we accumulate, or is it in the quiet recognition of our dependence on God's grace? Living with poverty of spirit means cultivating a heart that is open to God's leading and that doesn't cling to the false security of wealth or status. It is not about rejecting the good things God has blessed us with, but about putting those things in their proper place. When we are poor in spirit, we acknowledge that God is the source of all good things, and we trust Him to guide our lives, knowing that His kingdom is far greater than any earthly possession or achievement. 2. The deep meaning of poverty of spirit. To truly understand what Jesus meant by blessed are the poor in spirit, we need to dig deeper into its meaning. Poverty of spirit is not about lacking material wealth or physical possessions, but about possessing humility and spiritual dependence on God. It is an inner attitude that recognizes one's limitations and need for God's grace. It contrasts sharply with the spirit of self-righteousness or pride, where a person believes they can achieve everything through their own strength and wisdom. In the Bible, there are several stories that illustrate what it means to be poor in spirit. One example is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke 18 verses 9 to 14. The Pharisee, a religious leader, prays arrogantly, listing his good deeds and thanking God that he is not like other sinners. In contrast, the tax collector, a despised sinner, stands at a distance, beats his chest, and humbly asks for God's mercy. Jesus concludes the parable by saying that the tax collector, not the Pharisee, went home justified before God. This story highlights the difference between spiritual pride and spiritual poverty. The Pharisee was full of himself and saw no need for God's grace, while the tax collector recognized his brokenness and depended on God's mercy. Another biblical example is the widow's offering in Mark 12 verses 41 to 44. Jesus observes a poor widow who puts 2 small coins into the temple treasury. While many wealthy people gave large sums, Jesus points out that the widow's gift was far more significant because she gave all she had, demonstrating a complete reliance on God. The widow's act of giving, though modest in material terms, reflects a heart that is poor in spirit, one that trusts in God above all else, even when circumstances seem dire. Poverty of spirit, then, is not about the absence of wealth, but the presence of humility and dependence on God. It is about acknowledging our spiritual bankruptcy and our need for God's grace in every aspect of our lives. This kind of poverty is a choice to let go of pride, self-sufficiency, and self-righteousness. Instead, we choose to live with a heart that is open to God's leading, recognizing that true strength comes from God, not from ourselves. In modern society, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that success, wealth, and self-sufficiency are what make us valuable. But the message of Jesus is clear. True greatness in the kingdom of heaven is not about what we can achieve on our own, but about recognizing our need for God and living humbly in His presence. When we cultivate a spirit of poverty, we allow ourselves to be shaped by God's love and grace rather than by the fleeting values of the world. Being poor in spirit is a continual process of humility and self-reflection. It's a conscious decision to reject arrogance, pride, and self-reliance, and instead seek God's guidance and mercy. This spiritual poverty is a powerful force for transformation, both in our own lives and in the world around us. It enables us to live with greater compassion, empathy, and kindness, reflecting the love of God to others. Ultimately, the deep meaning of poverty of spirit is a call to spiritual growth and maturity. It's about aligning our hearts with God's will, acknowledging that we cannot live fully apart from Him, and trusting that He will guide and sustain us. As we embrace this poverty of spirit, we open ourselves to the richness of God's presence and the blessings of His kingdom. 3. Why the kingdom of heaven belongs to them? In Jesus' declaration, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." There is a profound promise that we should reflect upon. Jesus assures us that those who live with a poverty of spirit will inherit the kingdom of heaven. But what does this mean? What is the kingdom of heaven, and why does it belong to those who are poor in spirit? The kingdom of heaven is not a physical place that we can see or touch, but it is a spiritual realm where God reigns supreme. It is a place where God's will is perfectly done, where peace, justice, love, and righteousness rule. The kingdom of heaven is both a present reality and a future hope. Jesus teaches that those who are poor in spirit have access to this kingdom because they recognize their need for God and are willing to live according to His values, not the values of the world. The promise of the kingdom is not just for the future, but also for the present. When we are poor in spirit, we begin to live in alignment with the principles of God's kingdom. We embrace humility, service, and love, all of which are foundational to God's rule. The kingdom of heaven is marked by values that are often the opposite of the world's. humility instead of pride, self-sacrifice instead of self-promotion, and compassion instead of judgment. When we live in accordance with these values, we experience the blessings of the kingdom here on earth. Moreover, those who are poor in spirit are more likely to be receptive to the message of God's kingdom. Humility opens the heart to God's presence, while pride and self-sufficiency close the door. The spiritually humble person recognizes their dependence on God and welcomes His rule in their lives. This is why Jesus tells us that the poor in spirit are blessed. They are ready to receive the full blessings of the kingdom because they are not distracted by the false promises of wealth, status, or power, i.e. the teachings of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is often portrayed as something that belongs to the humble and the meek. In Matthew 5, verse 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The meek are those who do not seek power or dominance over others, but who live with humility and gentleness. Similarly, the poor in spirit are those who do not seek to elevate themselves, but recognize that true greatness comes from God alone. The message is clear. The kingdom of heaven is for those who live with humility, dependence on God, and a willingness to serve others. It is not a kingdom that rewards self-promotion or pride, but a kingdom that values meekness, humility, and righteousness. When we live in a way that reflects these values, we align ourselves with the kingdom of heaven, and it becomes a present reality in our lives. In this sense, the kingdom of heaven is not just a distant hope for the future, but a present reality for those who choose to live with a poor spirit. It is a kingdom that can be experienced here and now as we humble ourselves, live with compassion, and seek to serve others. The promise of the kingdom of heaven is available to all who live according to God's will and who are willing to embrace the values of humility and service. 4. Application in modern life. Now that we have explored the deep spiritual meaning of poverty of spirit and the promise of the kingdom of heaven for those who possess it, we are left with the question: how do we apply this teaching in our modern lives? In today's society, the values of humility and dependence on God often seem to be at odds with the culture around us. We live in a world that values success, status, and self-reliance. People are often encouraged to work hard, accumulate wealth, and seek personal achievement. The idea of poverty of spirit can seem countercultural, especially in a world that prizes self-sufficiency and independence. However, the application of this teaching is more relevant than ever. The virtue of poverty of spirit is not about renouncing everything we have, but about adopting a mindset of humility and openness to God. In practical terms, this means living with a sense of gratitude, recognizing that everything we have is a gift from God. It means letting go of the need for control and trusting God to provide for our needs. One of the most important ways to apply poverty of spirit is through service to others. Jesus modeled this throughout His life, and He calls us to do the same. In our daily lives, we can practice humility by serving those in need, whether it's through volunteering, helping a neighbor, or simply offering a kind word to someone who is struggling. Poverty of spirit calls us to put the needs of others before our own and to serve without expecting anything in return. Living with poverty of spirit also means being willing to share what we have with others. This doesn't just refer to material wealth, but also to time, energy, and emotional resources. A person who is poor in spirit recognizes that they are not the center of the universe and that their possessions and talents are meant to be shared for the good of others. In a world that often emphasizes individualism and personal success, practicing generosity and selflessness can be a powerful witness to the values of God's kingdom. Another key application of poverty of spirit is embracing simplicity in our lives. In a culture that promotes consumption and excess, learning to live simply can be a way to detach from the things that distract us from God. Simplicity allows us to focus on what truly matters: our relationship with God, our relationships with others, and living a life of service and humility. Lastly, poverty of spirit invites us to live with greater dependence on God. In a society that encourages self-sufficiency, it can be difficult to admit our need for God. Yet, Poverty of spirit teaches us that we are not meant to live in isolation, but in relationship with our Creator. We are called to surrender our pride, our need for control, and our dependence on our own strength, and to place our trust fully in God's provision. Point 5. Call to action as we come to the conclusion of our exploration into the concept of blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We are faced with a challenge. This teaching is not just something we reflect on in theory. It is something we're called to live out in our everyday lives. The message of Jesus asks us to shift our perspective and redefine what it means to be truly blessed. We are invited to embrace spiritual poverty, not a poverty of material wealth, but a poverty of spirit that places God at the center of our lives. Humility as the foundation of our lives. The first call to action is one of humility. Jesus teaches us that true greatness is not about being exalted in the eyes of others, but about humbling ourselves before God. This means letting go of pride, self-sufficiency, and the need for recognition. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to achieve more, to climb higher, and to gain more wealth and power. But the kingdom of heaven operates under a different set of values. Humility is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength, because it shows a complete trust in God's will and plan. Live humbly means recognizing that we are not the center of the universe, and that everything we have is a gift from God. Our achievements, our possessions, and even our talents are not ours to boast about, but rather are to be used for the greater good of others. A humble heart recognizes that we cannot achieve anything of lasting value without God's help, and that He is the one who gives us purpose and direction. Dependence on God. Living with poverty of spirit also means cultivating a deep dependence on God. In our modern world, we are often taught that we should be self-reliant and independent. While there is value in taking personal responsibility, Jesus reminds us that we cannot live truly fulfilling lives apart from God. The person who is poor in spirit understands that they are spiritually bankrupt without God's grace. We are all in need of God's mercy and guidance, and this recognition allows us to grow in our relationship with Him. Being dependent on God doesn't mean passivity or laziness. Rather, it means acknowledging that we need Him in every area of our lives. We must surrender our plans, our ambitions, and our desires to His will. As we do so, we will experience the peace and joy that come from knowing we are living according to God's purpose. Living for others. The poverty of spirit Jesus speaks about also leads us to live for others. When we recognize that our worth is not based on what we can accumulate or achieve for ourselves, we begin to focus on serving those around us. True spiritual poverty leads us to acts of kindness, generosity, and compassion. It challenges us to look beyond our own needs and to serve others, just as Jesus did during His time on earth. One powerful example of living for others is the story of the Good Samaritan. Luke 10 verses 25 to 37. In this parable, a man is beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. While a priest and a Levite pass by without helping, a Samaritan stops, shows compassion, and takes the man to an inn to be cared for. This story demonstrates that living a life of humility and dependence on God leads us to care for those in need, regardless of their status or background. The Samaritan's actions reflect a heart that is poor in spirit, one that sees the value of others and is willing to serve them. As we apply poverty of spirit in our daily lives, we should ask ourselves, how can I serve others today? Whether through small acts of kindness, listening to someone who is hurting, or helping someone in need, we are called to live with an open heart, ready to serve. Letting go of earthly attachments. Living with a poor spirit also means letting go of earthly attachments that distract us from God's kingdom. Jesus warned us that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. Matthew 6 verse 21. When we place our value in material possessions, success, or status, we begin to lose sight of the eternal blessings that God has for us. Poverty of spirit invites us to detach from these temporary things and focus on what is truly important: our relationship with God and our ability to serve others. This does not mean that we must abandon all our possessions or live in poverty. Rather, It means that we should not allow our possessions to control us. They should be seen as tools to help us live out God's will and to bless others. When we live with the understanding that everything we have is a gift from God, we can hold our possessions lightly and use them for His purposes. Living with simplicity and contentment. The final way to apply the poverty of spirit is through simplicity and contentment. The world often tells us that we need more possessions, more experiences, more success to be happy. But true happiness comes from living with simplicity and being content with what we have. When we live simply, we create space in our hearts and minds to focus on God and the things that truly matter. This simplicity is not about stripping away all comfort or luxury, but about choosing to live in a way that reflects our dependence on God and not on the things of this world. It's about finding joy in the simple pleasures of life, a quiet moment with God, time spent with loved ones, and acts of service that make a difference in the lives of others. When we live simply and contentedly, we are free from the pressure to constantly acquire more and can focus on the eternal joys of God's kingdom. Conclusion Jesus teaching. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Offers a radical vision of what it means to be truly blessed. To be poor in spirit is to live with humility, recognizing our dependence on God. It is to let go of pride, to serve others selflessly, and to live with simplicity and contentment. It is to shift our focus from the material world to the eternal values of God's kingdom. As we go about our daily lives, we are called to reflect on these values and to make intentional choices to live with a humble spirit. We are invited to serve others, to depend on God, and to let go of the things that distract us from His purpose. When we do so, we align ourselves with the values of the kingdom of heaven, and we begin to experience the blessings that Jesus promises. Living with a poor spirit is not easy, but it is the path to true freedom and fulfillment. As we cultivate humility, serve others, and depend on God, we open ourselves to the blessings of His kingdom, both now and in the age to come. May we all strive to live with a poor spirit, knowing that in doing so, we are blessed beyond measure.